So in this current NBA season, Chris Paul is on his way to definitely his first Western Conference Finals and maybe his first NBA Finals. JJ Redick could actually be joining him as the 76ers keep getting better every game. Jamal Crawford is still getting buckets for the T-Wolves, who were just eliminated by Chris Paul's Rockets, and Blake Griffin is now in Detroit, and, well, he's in Detroit. And what do all these guys have in common? Well, of course, they were a part of the 6-year run of the Los Angeles Clippers that began in 2012 and ended at the end of 2017. Some of these guys longer than others, of course. And we're going to dive into that 6-year run, which I think is one of the more interesting ones that we've seen in recent NBA history, where the highs were very high, and they seemed like a very talented team that could go on to at least make one NBA Finals, and who knows, potentially even win one, or at least go on some deep playoff runs. But then there were the lows, and boy were they low. So here we go, the rise and fall of the Los Angeles Clippers. To begin, let's start in 2011. We'll start on a high note. Blake Griffin electrifies Los Angeles, and his fellow big man DeAndre Jordan shows some good signs of improvement. But this is Blake's year for the Clippers. He wins Rookie of the Year, and he gets them started on the right foot. In that offseason, the Chris Paul controversy, where the trade to the Lakers was vetoed, and the Clippers would jump on the opportunity, trading away young scorer Eric Gordon, promising defensive wing Al-Farouq Aminu, established center Chris Kaman, and a first-round pick that would go on to become Austin Rivers. And so for the 2011-2012 season, Chris Paul brought his point guard qualities to LA as the team won 40 games in a lockout season, and it seemed like this was brewing to be something pretty special, as they now had their 1-2 punch for the next X amount of years with CP3 and Blake Griffin. The team around them, while not as talented, was something. Veterans like Caron Butler and Kenyon Martin gave them a sense of toughness and readiness, which they brought into their Round 1 series against the Memphis Grizzlies. And this series featured the historic 27-point comeback that would lead them to a Game 1 victory, which established the tone of the series as Memphis was never able to recover. Now in the second round, they would be swept by the San Antonio Spurs, but given that this was the first season of Chris Paul and Blake Griffin together, the fact that they got to the second round in such dramatic fashion, I would say that that was a good start for what was to come for this team. Then you fast forward to the 2013 season, they added scorer Jamal Crawford to put up buckets off the bench for them, and they also needed some toughness, which is why they added Matt Barnes in free agency as well, someone who would go on to be a huge piece for them for the majority of this run, for his defense as well as outside shooting. Eric Bledsoe also emerged as a quality backup point guard for them, and you combine all this with Blake Griffin getting a year better, and the Clippers had finally arrived. 56 regular season wins for a team that a lot of the time was just forgotten in the city of Los Angeles. And I would say this is around the time that this team started to get really fun, as they were one of the best offenses in the league. But at a certain point, the fun does stop, and they ran into the Memphis Grizzlies again. But this time around, this was the grit and grind Grizzlies. No Rudy Gay, built more along low post offense and being physical as hell. And those Memphis Grizzlies pushed and clawed and did whatever they could to Blake Griffin and this team, Zach Randolph the one doing a lot of the clawing, and the Clippers went down in round 1, and some questions started to arise for these guys if they were really ready for this stage. So then in 2014, they brought along Doc Rivers, a seasoned coach who had done some winning in Boston. They figure he's the type of guy who could get them over the hump. They also acquired JJ Redick during the offseason. He only played about 35 games, but his shooting was still felt, as this team needed floor spacers. They needed guys who were not about dribbling the ball so much, and JJ Redick definitely fit the bill there. And the other thing that helped these Clippers in 2014 is that DeAndre Jordan finally went to another level as he became one of the best rebounders and defensive bigs in the NBA. His chemistry with Blake Griffin improved as well. 57 wins for this Clippers team, and they managed to become even more exciting during the regular season. All of the pieces were in place. You had the scoring off the bench, you had the really good front court, you had the shooting with JJ Redick, maybe the best point guard in the NBA, but then they met the Golden State Warriors in round 1. And sure, they weren't the Warriors of today, but they were still a pretty decent team, and they pushed the Clippers to the brink. But with Game 7 being in Los Angeles, and being a bit more of a talented roster, the Clippers managed to get through them, and I think the consensus was that these guys were not done winning, even as they went into round 2 against the extremely talented Oklahoma City Thunder. They knew that their work was cut out for them, going up against Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, and this team, and they had played each other to nearly a stalemate, as it was a 2-2 series in Game 5 in Oklahoma City, and the Clippers were in a very good situation, as Jamal Crawford hit a three-pointer mid-fourth quarter to give them a double-digit lead. And then, with about a minute to go, Chris Paul would hit a mid-range jumper that would give them a 7-point advantage on these Thunder. As long as nothing terrible happened, it seemed like they were going to win this thing. And then Chris Paul would go on to have maybe the worst minute of his professional basketball career. Kevin Durant hits a contested three-pointer and then gets a layup out in transition to close the gap a bit, but the Clippers were still in control until Chris Paul would lose the ball to Russell Westbrook. And think about that for a second. Chris Paul, the guy who averages 2 turnovers a game, never loses the thing, just gets stripped in this big of a situation. Now, this all being said, the game was still not over just yet, but then on the very next possession, CP3 would foul Westbrook on a 3-point attempt, which then allowed him to get to the line and sink all 3 free throws to give the Thunder a 1-point lead. And even then, with still one more chance at about 6 seconds left, Chris Paul drove down and potentially fouled by Reggie Jackson, loses the ball, and just like that, there was now a 3-2 advantage for the OKC Thunder. You go back to Los Angeles, Kevin Durant went crazy in Game 6, and that was all she wrote. The Los Angeles Clippers, who were well on their way to potentially reaching the Western Conference Finals, and who knows what happens from there, are being sent home by Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, and the OKC Thunder. And I would say that this loss is one of the 2 significant defeats that this Clippers era suffered, and I think there are some who believe they never totally recovered from this one. Now, they had the opportunity to do it in the 2015 season, and it seemed like they were pretty okay. They didn't succumb to the disappointment of that one, as they won 56 games, 3rd straight year of winning at least 55 contests. And it seemed like this very talented team was just going to kind of figure it out. They get to round 1 against the defending champion San Antonio Spurs, and it was a bloodbath. They went all the way to Game 7, and then Chris Paul said, "No way in hell am I going to lose another big playoff game," as he would score nearly 30 points while being extremely efficient in this Game 7, and he hit one of the biggest shots of his career after Tim Duncan tied the game up with a late free throw. CP3 would hit a falling down, fadeaway hook shot with 2 guys over him with about a second left to electrify the Staples Center. Yes, the Clippers play in the Staples Center. I forget sometimes too. And then they would meet the Houston Rockets in round 2. The Houston Rockets featuring James Harden, Dwight Howard, a set of role players, and the 2 stars for Houston. It's well documented that their chemistry was never totally the best, and I think it was felt through this series as the Clippers just seemed like the better team. They had a couple of blowouts. It was Game 6 in Los Angeles, a chance to head on once again to the West Finals, and it seemed like this one was a sure thing, and then we all know what happened. The bench mob of the Houston Rockets just went crazy. Trevor Ariza, Corey Brewer, Josh Smith, Terrence Jones, Dwight Howard setting a million screens. Maybe the worst loss in the recent NBA memory. I mean, this thing was over. It was a blowout. You're at home. Their bench is in the game. James Harden's not even in there. And the Clippers just totally folded. I'm sure that it started off with some matchup problems and a couple of lucky three-pointers, but it soon just turned into stage fright for this star-studded team that just once again could not figure it out. Then you go to a Game 7 in Houston, and there's no way the Rockets are going to lose that game at that point. And then suddenly, through heartbreak and disappointment, those super fun Clippers teams of a couple of years earlier, it was kind of tough to remember that one. And this new image wasn't exactly the best. It didn't help that in 2016, Blake Griffin would suffer a knee injury, and then Chris Paul would hurt his hand in round 1 against the Portland Trailblazers, which led to them losing that series. It's too bad, because you have to assume that they would have won it if those two were actually in there. And then the year after against the Utah Jazz in 2017, Blake Griffin hurts his big toe of all things, and through his frustration there, he knew the situation. And then in a Game 7 in Los Angeles, this team would lose to the Jazz in round 1. And then before you know it, this collection of guys who it seems like are on their way to something, it's just done. And now we know Chris Paul, the sign and trade, he is now a member of the Houston Rockets. Blake Griffin was traded from the Clippers because they realized his insane contract was not going to help them in terms of building a team. JJ Redick is enjoying his time in Philadelphia as he left in free agency. And then Jamal Crawford left as a free agent from the Clippers as well. So what happened? Why are we here? Well, number one, I think for as great as Blake and CP3 are, you could argue that neither one of them are really good enough and never were good enough to be the best player on a championship team. Number two, it's pretty well documented that this team never had the best chemistry in the world. They didn't dislike each other necessarily, but they weren't friends. I think Doc Rivers' tendencies to complain to referees did not help. And you could say that if this team was just a little more close-knit, then the moment that Jason Terry hit a couple of shots, they wouldn't have just mentally exploded. But that's exactly what happened. They weren't able to band together and figure that one out. There's also the fact that they never had a full roster. I mean, Matt Barnes was pretty much the only quality role player that they were able to acquire throughout the entire run. Someone who would be willing to just put up 5 points if it was necessary, but he'll keep the ball moving, he'll play off of everybody, and he'll bring toughness and defense and all that. I mean, Spencer Hawes was a disaster of a signing. The idea of Jeff Green has always been better than actual Jeff Green, and they gave up a first-round pick for him. Speaking of a first-round pick, they traded one away because Jared Dudley was not healthy for them, and it's come out since that the Clippers training staff just didn't do a good job with him because he was able to get healthy through the Bucks in, 2 weeks is what I believe he said? So the combination of all those things, the team chemistry not being there, the roster not being the best, and you put all that together and you have a couple of unlucky breaks with injuries, and there you go, a team that was extremely exciting and it seemed like they could have been due for something great. In the end, it was just kind of a disappointment.